any Catholics who wanted to be faithful would disappear. And so it's kind of a lose-lose situation. It was really hard. His name is Father Chu Wenmo. And this is the first missionary priest who came from China. He was snuck in. Over the course of the 6 years, he actually baptized another 6,000. So the Catholic population grew from. So we're picking it up right after part 2. And we just heard the story of Peter E. Seung-hoon and E. Pyuk, John the Baptist, and their entourage of fellow intellectuals. We heard the story of how they were pushed to their limits, with E. Pyuk, for example, having to choose between his dad or the faith. His dad threatening to commit suicide because if he got caught, then the entire family would be killed. This is really like on the verge of 1794. And that brings us into the start of the first persecution in the church. So in the Church of Korea, 1791, when it's called Shinhae persecution, is really the first persecution. And that really took off because of the ancestral worship ban, right? But then from there, 1801 is the first major persecution. It's called the Shinyu persecution. So after the family worship was banned, several people were caught, and if they didn't worship, then they were forced to be executed because what they were doing was considered illegal, right? It's like, for example, in America, if we were to like step on the American flag, it's like, how dare you do that, right? This is grounds for treason. And so in Korea, if you didn't follow this Confucian form of ritual, then you were banned. But Archbishop of Beijing, having reviewed this practice along with the Holy Father, denounced it because according to Confucian culture, the understanding is that the spirit actually comes down and enters the presented meal during this rite. And so, in like Mexican culture, you have Dia de los Muertos and you have the altar for the repose. And sometimes you'll have like little snacks put out. And so similarly, in the Korean culture, you would have this table put out and you have this ritual called chesa. And in chesa, there's some rice wine like soju or sake that's put out, and you have a certain way that you present it. And then the spirit comes and enjoys the meal that you've placed and spends time with everyone there, the family. But when the Pope put a stop on this, any Catholics who wanted to be faithful would disappear and they wouldn't participate. But those who did participate were basically anathematized. They were excommunicated. So the Catholics were very careful to go into hiding. But if they noticed that any Catholics were not there at the ritual, they were too then called out and persecuted. And so it's kind of a lose-lose situation. It was really hard. And so during this period from 1794 to 1801, you had actually this huge wave of just popularity and growth in the church. So, mind you, in 1784 again, reviewing, Peter Lee Seung-hoon was baptized and then he was brought up. In 1794, we actually have a big movement. So his name is Father Chu Wenmo, and this is the first missionary priest who came from China. His baptismal name being James, so James Chu. He was snuck in. So there was a team. So Matthias Cho In-kil was really like the one who helped him in. And along with Matthias was Paul Yun Yuil and Sabas Chi Huang. And so as a team, they collectively snuck him into the country. And even some of the parishioners took one for the team. For example, in the process, Hang Yong-ik would masquerade, pretending to be father. He'd get captured, he'd be tortured, and he basically didn't rat out the priest. But during the priest's visit, he made tremendous efforts to baptize. So after the first missionaries, the lay people, they converted so many souls such that when Father James Chu arrived, there were 4,000 Catholics, right? Catholics baptized. When Father James Chu arrived and he got to work, over the course of the 6 years, he actually baptized another 6,000. So the Catholic population grew from 4,000 to 10,000. And so this was huge. Now, mind you, when Father James Chu arrived, again, because Catholicism was under attack, he had to go into hiding. And this is where a very special woman steps in. Her name is Columba Kang Wansuk. And Columba Wang, she was a wealthy widow, very wealthy. And she was a convert among the families who were of nobility. In Korean, we call them yangban. And so she would prepare food and she would hide Father Chu in this kind of like shed in the back of her place. And after having kept him there for a few months, eventually with the help of other women, she was able to keep him in the guest room for a few years. And this was basically his headquarters for the course of the several years. And while she was helping, Columba was then elevated by Father James to being a catechist. And so she was very intentional to form the young girls. And as the young girls were of age to get married, back then, it was similar to Mexico. I guess there are a lot of similarities in just general culture, because when the girls were about 15, 16, they were ready to get married, so they would get married, and there's a dowry and this whole process, and it's actually like culturally is very beautiful. But anyway, and then as they're getting married, even they would catechize their husbands, and then their husbands would join the church too. So you would have this huge influx of new converts, and that was thanks to Columba doing her part. And then in 1800, this is a pivotal year, because up until this point, there was a king in Korea. His name is King Chongjo. And King Chongjo was actually very privy to the Catholic Church. He was sympathetic, and so he didn't persecute them, even though many would argue that this is like Western kind of folk, right? Folk tale or folklore, and is very dangerous for the Confucian history. But King Jongjo, being sympathetic, then didn't push anything. But once he died in 1800, then his son came up, and yikes, when his son entered the scene, then the real persecutions began. And so his son, with the help of his mother, held nothing back. And at that point, so you got to imagine, over the course of the years, there's like 10,000 Catholics, and there's some serious key players among the 10,000. And in this persecution, there were 300 Catholics, more or less, that were martyred. And these were like the all-stars. So imagine the NBA, for example, and at the end of the year, you're collecting like the best players from every team, and you're making like the all-star conference teams from like the East and the West, right? That's basically what they did. And they picked all the superstars, the Catholics who were super virtuous and just living their faith with such zeal, and they just killed them all. And so we have some really heavy hitters among them. For example, his name is Thomas Kim, and he's one of the first. And I don't want to like sound too offensive here, so I'm sorry for anyone who's listening who might get offended or disturbed. But like, they cauterized Thomas's anus in an attempt to make him denounce his faith, and he wouldn't. And they tortured him so much. They would rub lime on his face and they would drag him around the city, drummed 3 times around the marketplace, and he still wouldn't denounce. And then a new magistrate appears, and he's torturing him again. Thomas tried to live such austerity that neighbors and different folk would try to give him new clothes or new shoes, and he would receive it and he'd give it to the next person thinking, this is not good for me. This is a worldly temptation. I don't need this. And so he was very simple, frugal. He lived very poor, and he was always trying to fight the sin of pride. At one point, he made it a point never to eat more than 1 meal. And this isn't like, oh, I'm going on a keto diet, so I'm going to eat 1 big meal. No, it's like you're barely eating anything, right? This is 1 small meal. And so it's really hard. There's some serious suffering. And then on the eve of his death, he actually didn't die a martyr in the sense of being beheaded although he endured the torture, but he fell ill of a disease just because of the fatigue. And then he died, predicting that he would die the next day. But when he died, he was found kneeling when he took his last breath. And there's quite a quote that talks about how he said, how he waited 9 years for this moment, right? And so it's pretty powerful. He was hoping to die a martyr for God. There's also a beautiful, similar story of another man who said he waited 9 years, and his name is James I. He was also killed in this persecution, again, the Shinhae persecution. And he had a friend named Lawrence Park. And the two of them had a few other friends. And what's beautiful about their story is that they agreed, they had a pact. Kind of reminds me of like C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien, the Inklings, right? They had a pact. But anyway, when one of them got caught, they agreed to throw each of them under the bus. So they all throw their names into the hat if one of them gets tortured. Why? Because it's an honor to be martyred. So they agreed if one of them gets martyred, that they would get martyred, and then honored together. Really intense. But what's interesting is that Lawrence got caught first, and when he was caught, he endured torture. Really, there's different types of torture, but he got a lot of whipping. And it says that he went through 1,400 strokes. These 1,400 strokes were on 17 different occasions. On top of that, he was kept from being able to have sufficient drinking of water. So he was suffering of thirst. And his endurance was seen as a miracle. And so they couldn't believe that he wasn't dying from the torture, and eventually he was executed. He was executed with Paul Lee, one of the other friends. So James I was also captured, right? And what's interesting is that when he was captured, he was expected to fess up all the names, including Lawrence Park. And he said that he would fess up the names, but then he just described the 3 people, and that was it. And so the persecutors, they said, is it true you practice the religion of the Lord of Heaven? He's like, yes, it is. And then they said, do you announce your accomplices? And he said, there are. And then he says, 3 other persons animated like me with the desire to worship God and to give their life for him. The end. And so they're like, we need names. And he said, I gave you more than enough. I've explained myself clearly. And so he didn't give them any of the names. And so he said, even if I had to undergo 10,000 deaths, I could not put it more clearly than I have. So that just gives you a sense of his loyalty to his friends. Then he was then transferred to the criminal court called Hongju, and there he went through some more serious flogging and more intense persecution. His bones were broken. He was cruelly beaten. And then he too was tortured to the point of eventually dying under the blows on the 3rd lunar month of 1799. So this is like right at the peak of the start of the persecution. I mean, there's so many different people, heroes that were killed during this period, and they were brought from different parts of Korea. Even Jeonju, for example, there's Lugartha Lee, Yuhae, and John Ryu Chongson, and they are the Josephite husband and wife, meaning they both wanted to live a consecrated life to God, and they were instead forced to marry because that's just part of the Confucian law. So the priest told them to get married, right? Father James Wenmo told them, you got to get married for the sake of the law, but you have to live as brother and sister. You have to imagine just like how difficult that is, because as a husband and wife, they have to live together under one roof. And, you know, they're at the prime of puberty, like, and so the urge is unbelievably strong, and yet they fought it and remained virgins until their martyrdom, which says a lot for the young men and women of this day and age, that it can happen, that it is possible to remain chaste if you so seek and will it. There was a young man named Francis Lee. It's crazy. His name is Francis Lee Po-hyun. And after he converted, he was so steadfast that after he was arrested, they tried to put him through a series of tortures, and eventually they couldn't get him to break, to denounce his faith. So after severely beating him on his back, they flipped him over onto his back, and they just kept brutally punching his privates. And actually, through that, he actually died. So that's pretty wild. That said, the Shinyu persecution ended at the end of 1801. And there was, again, a lot of bloodshed. And the martyrs from this died a very meritorious and glorious martyrdom. So all the confessors and the people that survived really were inspired by their heroism, but also kind of shocked, like, how do we keep up with this? What do we do now? Right? Because these are huge shoes they got to fill. And so Father James Wenmo also, realizing that so many of them were dying under his watch, he felt this weight as the shepherd that it was because of his presence that the government kept attacking, right? So he felt this need to have to disappear, because as long as he's there, more and more of his flock are being murdered, massacred. So he makes a run for it and tries to go back to China. And he actually gets to the border. And this is an intense story, but he looks down and he realizes that by one more step, that's his freedom and that's his escape. But in that moment, he had a moment of clarity in which he encountered our Lord. Kind of very similar to St. Peter in Rome, as he was just over the Tiber, the Quo Vadis, we would call it, where Jesus appeared to him and he went back and went into Rome to get crucified. Because Father James Chu then turned around himself and walked back into Seoul, and he turned himself in to the High Court of Justice, and then was martyred. You know, you can imagine all of the faithful, upon seeing the first priest, the first missionary of Korea, having come to give of his life, and how many of them were telling him not to, because in some ways, like, he was the hope. He was the one that was ministering the sacraments, the Mass, you know, Viaticum. But so he died a heroic death during this persecution. And that leaves all these faithful that are still in hiding, and that ends the wave of that first persecution. But now you have the remaining Korean Catholics that are extremely impoverished, and they're all in hiding. And they have nothing to live off of. And so they're just, as a community, suffering deeply. But in the suffering, there is this really intense bond of love, knowing that they can lean on one another, that they have no one else but each other to lean on. And so there is this really tight band in the community, rooted in Jesus Christ. And that is what sets the stage for the next decades. Well, thank you for listening. I hope you enjoyed what I had to share. If you want to hear more about the Korean Church's history, make sure you subscribe, smash that like button, and I'll see you in the next one.